First, we're going to start with an update on the heat stress standard and what we're seeing right now. I know a lot of people have probably heard about this. A lot of people have been talking about this. It's kind of been the talk of the town recently. Brief history on heat stress. Just kidding, we're not going to go that far back. But it does go that far back, right? We've been dealing with heat stress forever, and yet we still don't have an actual standard that is enforceable by OSHA. We have the general duty clause, we'll talk about that, but we don't have an actual standard that's enforceable by OSHA, which is wild because it's such a ubiquitous stress or ubiquitous hazard, right? And it's something that we've dealt with for so long, but the more you look into it, the more you realize we also don't know as much as you might think we would know about it. And even then, when that's on the academic side, we go back to the kind of the average worker in a factory, worker in an assembly plant. There's just not a lot of push down of communication of the things that we do know about how we're supposed to deal with that, right? And then you try to implement controls and get people to be on board with those controls. So there are lots of reasons why we don't have a standard yet, but it's coming fast. So I'm going to talk about that. 1971, OSHA is founded on the general duty clause, right? We have the general duty of employers to provide a safe and healthful work environment. 1970s, NIOSH first publishes their criteria for recommended standard. That was then updated again in the 80s and then updated one more time in 2016. And that's actually very closely tied to the proposed standard now because there are some things in that standard that we're now using as an actual means of calculating a recommended exposure limit, which is actually going to be effectively the PEL, right? So we'll get more into that in a second. 1980s, OSHA issues the first heat stress guidelines. These are not standards, just guidelines known as the Heat Stress Technical Manual. That's really for their employees, but it was published outside of OSHA. 1990s, OSHA publishes the Working in Hot Environments document. That was an educational document, kind of getting the workforce ready to see this as a hazard. In the 2000s, we had lots of labor organizations push for regulation. This was not employers, but labor organizations and safety groups. Then we get into 2010 to present, further developments toward the regulation. In 2014, OSHA launches a heat stress education campaign. That's actual OSHA time and the actual OSHA employees going out and training as well as providing materials. 2021, OSHA issues a request for information seeking input for the need for a formal heat stress standard. And that's the first step in actually looking at making a standard for a specific hazard, right? So do we need it? Let's look at industry and see if anyone thinks that we need it. 2023, OSHA proposes new rules aimed at heat stress, heat injury, and illness prevention. 2024, in July of this year, OSHA releases the first look at the actual text of the proposed rule, which was quite a bit ahead of the timeline that people were expecting. We didn't think it was going to come till quite a bit later, but turns out to apparently be fairly political, and it is in line with trying to get things done before the change in administration. If there's a significant change in ideology, then there may be some cancellation of the progress that OSHA has been making so quickly this year. So then August 30, 2024, OSHA publishes the proposed rule in the Federal Register. Now it says, according to the OSHA documentation, that you have until December 30th, 2024 to submit your comments, right? So it's an open comment session right now. So KERAMIDA is a part of several industry organizations that are commenting on this. But that said, the end of the standard under the timeline section, the proposed rule, it gives 60 days until it's live, right? So it's anyone's guess as to how fast that actually happens or if there's a federal court stay or anything like that. So we're gonna stay on top of it and make sure that everybody who needs to know knows. So it's, like I said, it's open to public comments right now. So brief overview of the rulemaking process so you can see where we're at. You have your research and identification. It shows that there's need. And then you have the initiation of the rulemaking process, so the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and then the notice of proposed rulemaking, and that's already passed. Public comment periods, we've had one at the beginning. You can comment along the whole timeline, but now there's another request for comments since it was published in the Register. Review of the final rule, and then it's published. And then we have, after publication, we have, of course, when it goes into effect, and then employers must comply, right? And that's that full timeline. And we're rapidly getting toward this end. And so there's a lot that you're gonna have to know about what OSHA expects of almost all employers in the US. And you'll see why I say almost all employers here in a second, because we're gonna talk about the scope and applicability of it. So you have to have a HIP, heat injury and illness prevention plan. This is very similar to the injury and illness prevention plans that are in California, right? And the way that it's organized, and the way that you have to have all your documentation in one basket. So it's a comprehensive list of employees or work activities covered by the plan, all the policies and procedures that you need to enact that plan and actually, execute the controls that you're talking about in the plan, and then identification of the heat metric the employer will monitor, and that is an option that's given to you: heat index or wet bulb globe temperature, okay, or WBGT. You'll see it spelled out a lot. We're going to park on that a little bit in just a minute to talk about what the benefits of choosing one or the other are and what that really means, because that's going to be a very important part of compliance with this standard. The initial heat trigger, that's kind of like the action level, right? If you could think of it like an action level, I call it initial heat trigger. That's at 80 degrees heat index, or the NIOSH recommended action level, basically. That's basically what that is. The RAL action limit for WBGT. They actually call it the recommended alert limit, but it's basically an action level when we think about it in terms of OSHA, other OSHA regulations. When we go beyond that, I want to talk about what is heat index. This is an approximation of heat index. That's what this formula looks like, or that's what this formula is. If you do this formula, this is the published approximation. This is not actually it. There's still like a 1.3 standard deviation on this, but it's close. So do you plug all your temperature in and humidity a bunch of times and try to figure this out? Or do you go to the calculator at the National Weather Service? I'd recommend this, but there's another option that you could choose, which is a chart. You can just find it on the chart, or basically every heat stress monitor that's made today has heat index already calculated for you on there, right? Don't make this, there's a lot of stuff that we got to do here, so don't make it more complicated on yourself than you need to, right? There are a lot of really good tools out there, a lot of good ways of doing this and tracking this, and automated storage of data points and everything that you're going to have to do will make your life a lot easier. So embrace the newer technology on some of this, and you'll be glad you did. So what is WBGT? This, if you look at this, there's the W in this formula is the naturally ventilated wet bulb temperature. So that's basically a bulb of glass with a thermometer that's got water on it all the time, right? And so the idea is that accounts for air movement, because there's an evaporative cooling effect, right? So when you sweat, if you have a fan on you, it's going to feel cooler than if you don't have a fan on you. If you sweat and it's high humidity, it's going to feel warmer than if it's low humidity, because it all has to do with your evaporation rate, right? There's energy that it takes to evaporate moisture, and that energy comes out as heat. And so we see that here in the naturally ventilated wet bulb temperature. We have 70% of that plus 30% of this, which is the temperature inside of a black globe. The reason we have a thermometer inside a black globe is so that it can account for the change in temperature from radiant heat, right? But what happens when we go outside? That's what this one is, the second one, WBGT out. We have 70% of the wet bulb, 20% of the black globe, and 10% of what we call the common dry bulb, which is basically just a thermometer inside of a little metal sack, or like a mesh sack, or sometimes just an open air thermometer. And so when we look at this, what we're seeing here is when you're outside, OSHA wants you, and NIOSH and everybody who's developed the WBGT wants you to take 20% of radiant heat and 10% of air temperature, right? So there's a change there. So I'm going to talk here in just a second about why that's important to understand. So don't worry about the formula. You can easily find this. You plug in some information and OSHA will crunch the numbers for you. It's not even as bad as it looks here. That's only if you're estimating certain things. So there's calculators for WBGT, but again, there's also a device, right? You get a WBGT monitor, you stick it there, it's got the globe on it and everything, and it'll just tell you what the value is. There are devices that don't even have the water in them now. And I've got a couple of these here that I can bring out if you want to see them. But it uses actual air speed to approximate that. Okay, so there's some really good tech out there that'll help us with this. There's also some charts. Keep in mind, when you see a chart, you know that there's a lot more factors than what you'd have to use to make this chart. And so what it's going to have to do is, here it says at the bottom, this is assuming a clear sky with maximum solar load. It's assuming a certain humidity, blah, 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 right? So if that's not you, if you're not outside with a clear sky, this is not you, right? So be very careful about using the charts. The charts are are fixed, and there's a lot of variables that can move, especially when you're in an indoor environment. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit hairy. It seems like a simple relationship here. This is what OSHA standard talks about. It talks about the RAL and the REL. So I know it seems like we're getting pretty far in the weeds, but it's because OSHA's gotten pretty far in the weeds on this. If you select the WBGT, what standard number are you going to compare it against to see whether you've crossed that line? OSHA doesn't give it to you. They say, if you pass the NIOSH REL. Well, what's the NIOSH REL? Well, the NIOSH REL is not given to you, right? The formula for it is given to you. And then in the actual recommendations for a proposed rule, you have a recommended rule in the NIOSH document. It actually says use a reputable source or some other information to develop what they call the metabolic rate in watts for the task that you're performing. You know how you actually measure metabolic rate? You put someone inside of a glass box on a treadmill or doing whatever task that they're doing. That glass box has a chamber that's filled with water all around it. That water's circulating, and you have them do the task, and you measure the change in temperature of the water over a long period of time. You're not going to do that in industry. You're just not. The only way that we're going to do this is by estimating it or doing some kind of chart comparison to a similar task, right? And so keep that in mind. OSHA doesn't say you can't do that. They don't say you should do that. They don't say hardly anything in this standard about how you come up with that RAL number, right? So this is tricky. Is that RAL number better than a heat index? Yes. As an industrial hygienist, I want to say we should always use a WBGT. But what do I compare it against? That's pretty harsh from the OSHA standard rulemaking perspective here. So I'm going to skip through this. This is a chart from that same document. I'm going to take 349 watts, plug it in, and show you what happens. All right, so I've plugged it in with these conditions. 92 degrees Fahrenheit, relative humidity of 20%, basically no wind movement, and basically no radiation. So you're indoors, and there's not a lot of movement, right? Pretty standard indoor, like LED lighting, not getting a lot from of radiant heat, okay? This gives us a WBGT for a limit, an REL of 82.4. I did all the math on the back end from the NIOSH side. The heat index is 90 because it's always going to be 90. It doesn't change at all. It's right there in the standard. It says if you use the heat index, the REL is 90, right? But in this condition, the REL for WBGT is 82.4. So these are your two options for comparison. These are our two measurements in these conditions. In these conditions, we have a WBGT of 72.9 and 88.3 for heat index. Both of them are less than their rule, right? Both of them are less than the limit that you would have used to compare. So we're good. You can be inside in this condition and you're not in breach of the REL. What happens if I change this to outdoors? About 1,000 watts per square meter. I end up with, look what happens with WBGT. It goes 72.9 to way over the limit. Does this change? Not at all, because heat index doesn't account for radiation, right? So all of a sudden, based on selecting one of the options that OSHA gives me, I'm either in compliance or I'm not in compliance. You see that? You get to choose arbitrarily whether you're in compliance or not in compliance in this scenario, based on how you say it. That's what it really comes down to. So this standard is odd. This is not, from someone who focuses on protecting workers, this standard lets me say I'm protecting them or not protecting them in the same exact condition. That's weird, right? We don't generally think that way. If I change it again and I bump this back down and I bump up humidity, guess what? It changes. Now this one's in compliance and this one's not. It's still 92 degrees, right? So conditions tell you one way or another whether heat index or WBGT are going to actually let you be in compliance or not be in compliance, because there's things you can do to be over that limit, but whether or not you're over the REL. So keep that in mind. What method for measurement that you select is really important. The standard applies to all employers except no reasonable expectation of exposure beyond either of these. So if you're an office building that's always air conditioned and all of your employees are in there, you're exempt, okay? If you have one employee that's not in that condition, you're not exempt and you have to have the program. It says all employees in the standard. Short duration exposures, that's less than 25% of an hour. Not 25% of the day. You can't have 2.5, or you can't have 2 hours out of an 8-hour day in this heat. It's 25% of a given hour. Okay, so then you're exempt. But keep in mind, when it says the standard applies, the standard does not include the general duty clause. So there still is the general duty clause. If you hurt somebody, OSHA is still holding you responsible. I want to focus on this real quick. No reasonable expectation is used in this phrase from the standard. The word reasonable comes up 5 times in the standard. The word appropriate comes up 3 times. The word reputable sources, the phrase reputable sources, comes up 2 times, and the rest of them come up 1 each. Suitably cool, excessive body temperature, employer determines, employer chooses, and if needed. Guess how many of these have a definition? 0, right? So this is going to be pretty interesting to watch, to see how this happens, and then what the appeals look like when people start getting dinged for this. All right, so a summary of employer requirements. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically you have all these requirements. I think there's like 17 on here, and these are just the categorical requirements. There are other requirements on how you achieve these, okay? You can be exempt from some and not others, depending on whether it applies to you or not, depending on whether you're over the REL or between the REL and the RAL. Anyway, there's a lot going on here. This is something that we don't see a lot of in industry, in terms of really good calibrated and functional plans that companies are using to comply with, or not comply with, but to protect people from heat stress. And so unfortunately, there's not a lot of knowledge out there about how this works kind of intuitively. And so that's something that we're doing, is we're teaching people how to do this, right? So we're going to you'll see if you look online or whatever, we're going to post some sessions that are available to basically train your assigned person that this standard calls out for. You have to have somebody assigned. If you have 40 people in a work environment that requires a heat stress monitor, like an individual to monitor them, you got to have 2 of them, because OSHA says your highest ratio is 20-1 in the standard. Okay, so if nothing changes in the standard language, everything we've talked about today is going to become requirement. All right, now I suspect that some of it will change because there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of things that people are still asking about. I'm going to skip this, but these are some things that we've been involved in. We've taken part in a lot of this process from the beginning, and done a lot of field testing, and been part of developing some equipment and things like that. Any questions while I'm doing this about the heat stress standard and what it means, or what we need to be, what we're up against?
A lot of good information, Dan. Appreciate you giving us an update on that potential standard coming down the road, because it will impact a lot of folks.
It will. It will, and it is. I mean, it's extremely significant in terms of the number or percentage of your employees that will actually be affected by it as well. All right. Thanks, everybody.